Germany, 1945. The war had ended, but not for Anna. She stood every evening by the broken bridge of Frankfurt, staring at the river that once carried her husband's laughter. He had never returned. Just a telegram with one word: missing. When the American POW camp was set up nearby, Anna was hired as a nurse. She swore she'd never speak to an American. But one evening, she found Private John Miller, a wounded prisoner, reciting a poem in broken German. Over months, through shared bread and quiet glances, silence turned to words, and words turned to touch. But love between a German widow and a captured enemy was forbidden. A crime. When John was released, he left her a letter hidden under his bandage. If peace ever reaches your heart, find me where the sun sets. Anna never found him. But in 1951, a postcard arrived from Ohio, a field of sunflowers with 3 words: Peace found you, Poland, 1944. In the shadow of a barbed wire camp, a Polish girl named Eliza played her father's violin every night, not for joy, but to drown the screams. A German officer named Klaus ordered the music stopped. But when he heard her play Schubert's Serenade one foggy night, he didn't give the order again. He began standing by the fence, listening in silence. He told himself it wasn't love, only pity, until the day he slipped her a piece of bread carved with his name. When the camp was liberated, Klaus was captured by the Allies. Eliza survived and performed in Vienna years later. In the audience, an old man wept quietly, his left hand missing 2 fingers, but his heart remembering every note. France, 1943. Marie's husband, a resistance fighter, had been captured months ago. Every week, she received letters in his handwriting: hope, poems, promises. But when the camp was liberated, her husband's name appeared on the list of those executed long before the first letter ever came. The truth was devastating. A German translator named Emil had found her address and began writing, pretending to be her husband, just to keep her alive, to give her hope. Years later, Marie found Emil's grave in a forgotten cemetery. On the stone were the words, "He lied to save a heart." Italy, 1945. Lucia was a Red Cross nurse, tending wounded Allied soldiers. One day, she found a German pilot, barely alive, hiding in the monastery ruins. The orders were clear: report any enemy. But his eyes weren't of a killer, only of a man too young for war. She hid him for 40 days. They shared stories under candlelight, of childhoods, of skies, of dreams. When the Allies discovered him, Lucia claimed she was forced, but they both knew the truth. After the war, a letter arrived from Munich, a drawing of the monastery signed, "To the woman who taught me mercy, Norway, 1945. An Allied POW, found wandering the forest, remembered nothing, not his name, not his home. He was taken in by a young widow named Ingrid, whose husband had been lost at sea. They fell in love, without names, without pasts, only silence, warmth and snow. Months later, a newspaper photo revealed his identity: a missing British pilot, declared dead, with a wife and daughter waiting in London. He left quietly that night. Ingrid found only a note by the door: "I remember nothing except you." Germany, 1944. In the women's camp of Ravensbrück, a young inmate named Sophia sketched prisoners when no one watched. One day, a German officer caught her, but instead of punishing her, he whispered, "Draw me as the man I was before this uniform." For months, he smuggled her pencils, paper, and hope. When he was transferred, Sophia hid his portrait in the camp wall. After liberation, the wall was torn down, and behind it, a photograph. Sophia smiling, taken secretly by him, labeled Proof of Soul. Belgium, 1944. During the Ardennes offensive, An American soldier named Davis was trapped with a wounded German boy in the same bunker. Both sides retreated, and snow began to fall. Davis shared his rations. The boy whispered, "If we live, promise, no more hate." Only Davis survived. 10 years later, he traveled to Germany to find the boy's family. In a small village, he saw a gravestone with the words, "He died believing enemies can forgive." Siberia, 1946. A forgotten Soviet POW camp where no one returned alive. But one Russian nurse named Anya began sending letters for prisoners secretly to their families, against Soviet command. She fell in love with a German linguist, Heinrich, who translated them. When they were discovered, both were executed. But the letters survived, hidden in a hollow wall. In 1989, when the archives opened, hundreds of families received their first news in 40 years, each signed from those who still believed in love. France, 1945. Claire, a young seamstress, was tasked to sew uniforms for German prisoners. Among them was a British soldier forced into German service after capture. They spoke little, just exchanged needles and thread. When he escaped, he left behind his tag inside her sewing kit. Years later, she found it again while teaching her granddaughter to sew. She held it close and whispered, "War separates, but love leaves marks that never fade." The world rebuilt itself, piece by piece. But beneath the ruins, beneath the silence, lay hundreds of untold stories, where enemies became lovers, killers became poets, and hope grew in the cracks of hatred. These weren't tales of victory or loss. They were proof that even in the darkest age of humanity, love refused to surrender. In post-war Germany, the streets were lined with rubble and resentment. The occupation had begun, and with it came an uneasy peace. American soldiers now walked where German families once hid, bringing chocolate for the children and curiosity for the women who had lost everything. But behind every smile was a quiet judgment. Many German wives were seen as symbols of shame, accused of consorting with the enemy, even when all they wanted was survival. One such woman was Greta Hoffmann, a schoolteacher from Dresden. Her husband had perished in the firestorm of 1945, and her home was reduced to ashes. When an American engineer named Samuel arrived to rebuild bridges, he noticed her carrying bricks alone in the rain. He offered help. She refused at first, pride still standing when everything else had fallen. But he kept returning, wordless, stacking stones beside her until the wall began to rise again. Over time, Greta learned that Samuel had lost his brother to the war. In Normandy, under German fire. They never spoke of it, yet the silence between them became its own language. When winter came, Samuel shared his rations, leaving them quietly at her doorstep. The neighbors whispered. Fraternization, they called it, a betrayal of both nations. But neither Greta nor Samuel cared anymore. On Christmas Eve, he brought her a small gift, a piece of stained glass he'd found in the ruins of a cathedral. "Something that survived," he said softly. She looked at the fragile piece, shimmering in candlelight, and whispered, "Maybe we did too." Years later, in 1956, Greta received a letter from America. Inside was that same piece of glass, framed in oak, with a note. "I built a church in Ohio. I thought it should have your light." It was signed simply, Sam. Across the Atlantic, in a small town in Kansas, life had returned to normal. But for Margaret Lawson, whose husband died in the Battle of the Bulge, peace never came easily. The local newspaper ran an article, "German war brides arriving in America." Margaret stared at the photo. young women stepping off a ship, clutching babies wearing hope on their faces. Her neighbors scoffed, calling them enemy women. But something inside Margaret stirred. Pity, perhaps. Or maybe something deeper. When one of those brides, Helga, moved into the town's edge with her American husband, the gossip grew louder. People crossed the street to avoid her. Margaret watched her from her porch, day after day, until one morning she saw Helga struggling with groceries, a child in her arms. Without a word, Margaret walked over and took the basket from her. Helga froze, terrified of rejection. But Margaret smiled faintly and said, "I lost someone too." That was all it took. From that day, they shared coffee on quiet mornings, trading stories, not of sides, but of loss. One had lost a husband to war. The other had lost a country. Yet somehow, in each other, they found the beginning of forgiveness. In 1952, the War Brides Act had already allowed thousands of German women to come to America, marrying their former enemies. It wasn't easy. Many were met with scorn, denied housing, insulted in grocery lines. But they endured. They raised families who would grow up never knowing the bitterness their parents once tasted. For them, the war had ended, not through surrender, but through kindness. There was one such family in Boston, Erica and James Porter. He had been a paratrooper. She, the daughter of a German baker. They met after the war, when Erica worked in a Red Cross office translating letters for POWs. James had lost a friend who was captured by the Germans. He came to the office often, hoping to find any record. Erica was the one who found it, a final letter never sent. She translated it for him in trembling English. "Tell my friend James, I forgive him for surviving." That night, neither spoke again. But when James left, he turned and said, "If there's anything worth fighting for now, it's people like you." A year later, they were married. The town didn't approve. Her accent drew whispers. Her past drew stares. But James always walked proudly beside her, as if daring the world to challenge his choice. When their first son was born, Erica named him Carl, after the German friend James had lost. Years later, when Carl grew old enough to ask, "Why did you name me after someone who died in the war?" James smiled and said, "Because forgiveness deserves a name too." By the 1960s, most of the bitterness had faded, but memories remained like scars beneath the skin of nations. Some Americans still carried resentment, passed down like a warning. Some Germans still carried guilt, whispered between generations. Yet amid all that pain, stories like Greta's, Helga's, and Erica's shone quietly. Proof that even the deepest wounds could heal. In one interview decades later, an elderly Erica said, "The Americans, they were not our enemies anymore. They became the hands that helped us rebuild our hearts." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at a black and white photo on her lap. Her wedding day, standing beside the man who once wore the uniform of her enemy. And maybe that's what history never tells us enough. Not about the wars we fought, but the peace we built afterward. Because sometimes, peace wasn't signed on paper. It was whispered between a German wife and an American soldier who refused to see her as an enemy. It was in the hands that rebuilt walls, the letters that crossed oceans, the children born with two heritages, learning that love has no nationality. These were not the headlines of 1945, but they were the quiet victories that shaped the world that followed. For in every ruined street, every broken heart, and every home rebuilt from ashes, America's ancestors left behind more than soldiers and stories. They left proof that compassion could outlive war. And perhaps that was their greatest victory of all. After the war, there were two kinds of people left in the world: those who wanted to forget and those who couldn't. Among the latter was Helen Matthews, a young American nurse who had served in field hospitals across France. She had seen the worst: men torn apart by shells, mothers wailing over lifeless children, and the faces of soldiers who didn't know which country they belonged to anymore. When she returned home, she thought peace would heal her. But in 1946, she volunteered for the occupation forces in Germany, the place she once associated with the enemy. She arrived in Stuttgart, a city half dust, half hope. Streets echoed with silence, and every building seemed to wear the face of loss. One evening, while distributing medical supplies, she met a woman named Liesel, pale, thin, clutching a baby. Helen gave her medicine, milk powder, and a soft smile. But when Liesel whispered "Danke," something in Helen's chest broke. That word, "thank you," spoken in the language she had once hated, felt heavier than all the gunfire she had survived. Over the weeks, Helen began helping Liesel more often, sneaking her extra blankets, a little bread. Other nurses warned her not to get involved. "They're the reason we were there," one said. But Helen couldn't see enemies anymore. She saw hunger, she saw fear, she saw humanity. One night, Liesel confessed her story. Her husband had been a German soldier who deserted in 1944 after realizing the war was lost. The Gestapo found him and executed him for treason. She had buried him in secret, without a name, without a priest. Helen didn't know what to say. She simply took her hand. For the first time since she'd come to Germany, she prayed, not for victory, not for peace, but for forgiveness. Years later, when Helen returned to America, she brought with her a small box. Inside were the ashes of a candle Liesel had given her, with a note: "You lit the light for me when I forgot what hope was." Helen kept it until her death in 1983. Her children found it and never understood its meaning, only that their mother had carried a piece of her enemy's love for almost 40 years. In another part of Germany, in Munich, there lived a man named Otto, who once wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht. After the war, he spent his days repairing bicycles, never speaking of what he'd seen. But one day, an American tourist stopped by, an old veteran named Frank. They began talking, first about the weather, then about the war. When Otto learned Frank had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, he froze. That was the battle where his own brother had died. Frank saw the pain in his eyes and quietly said, "I lost my brother there too." For a long moment, they said nothing. Then Otto placed his hand over Frank's and whispered, "Then maybe we both paid enough." From that day on, they met every year. Same cafe, same date, December 16th. Not to remember the battle, but to remind themselves that peace is not the absence of war. It is the decision to stop fighting inside yourself. By the 1970s, a new generation had arrived, one that hadn't heard the bombs, but lived in the shadow of those who did. They were children of two worlds, German mothers and American fathers, raised on two languages, two flags, two sets of memories. Some were ashamed, others were proud, but all of them carried the same truth, that love had survived where logic said it shouldn't. One of those children, Michael Reynolds, grew up in Chicago. His mother Ingrid was German, his father a former U.S. Marine. At school, kids called him the Kraut's son. He never told them that his mother had been just 17 when the war ended, that she'd spent her childhood hiding from bombs, and her adulthood hiding her accent. She worked 2 jobs, never spoke of the past, and smiled every time he asked about Germany. But her eyes always turned distant, as if staring at a photograph only she could see. When Michael grew older, he asked his father how they met. His father said only, "She saved me." Years later, Michael found an old letter tucked between photo albums. It was written in shaky German, stained with age. It read, "He was bleeding in the street. I didn't know he was American. I only saw a man who needed help. I hid him in the cellar until the soldiers came. I thought I'd be executed. Instead, I found the rest of my life." Michael later visited Germany, stood in the same street where his mother once lived, and realized that his very existence was born from a single act of mercy. He wrote in his diary that night, "If there's one proof that humanity survived the war, it's that I exist." The story of German wives and American soldiers wasn't just a tale of forbidden love. It was a quiet revolution, one that rewrote the meaning of victory. It showed the world that compassion can outlive propaganda, and that sometimes the bravest act a person can make isn't pulling a trigger, but holding out a hand. Decades after the war, when journalists interviewed American veterans who had married German women, one old sergeant said something that silenced the room. "We were told not to love them, but love's not a command you can follow. It's a surrender you don't regret." In towns across the U.S., those couples built lives that redefined what it meant to be American. Their homes became symbols of reconciliation, laughter replacing suspicion, accents blending into lullabies. Their children grew up with bedtime stories not of conquest, but of compassion. And slowly, without speeches or parades, the wounds between two nations began to fade. It's easy to remember war through dates, battles, and names carved in stone. But history is not just written in victories and losses. It lives in the unseen gestures: a nurse's hand, a soldier's letter, a widow's prayer. It's in the quiet bravery of people who chose to forgive when the world told them not to. And maybe that's the greatest inheritance America's ancestors left behind. Not just freedom or victory, but the ability to see humanity in those once called enemies. Because when history fades, what remains are not the flags or the medals, but the hearts that refused to harden. So when the world speaks of war, remember this: there were also bridges built, not just destroyed. There were hands that reached out across oceans. There were German wives who found kindness in foreign faces, and American men who learned that sometimes the greatest strength is mercy. And somewhere, in the ruins of forgotten towns, the echoes still remain, of laughter, of forgiveness, of love that outlived the war.